Welcome to Building My Legacy podcast. This podcast is designed for leaders and entrepreneurs who want to leave a legacy and will provide strategies that focus upon key elements for legacy creation, determining your desired impact and its benefit, increasing your legacy's reach by engaging key stakeholders, planning, prioritizing, and executing. Here's your host, Dr. Lois Sonstegard.
Welcome, everybody, to Building My Legacy podcast today. Today, I am with Kim Bohr. She is a really exciting person in terms of things that she's accomplished in her career. But I think also some of the things that she has done really push us in our thinking in terms of where are we going next? What is it next that we're trying to do with our lives and with our careers? So Kim Bohr is an author. She's an in-demand speaker, a coveted executive advisor. She's CEO of Innovare Group. It's a firm that's known for diagnosing and repairing organizational leadership disconnects. And Kim, I want to talk more with you about what does that really mean and how do you do that? Working both with companies and leaders, she helps them to assess, align, and accelerate the strategic priorities that impact their talent, execution, and business growth. She works a lot with VC companies, startups, mid-market companies, and progressive corporate teams, guiding them in their sales and marketing operations functions, and really looks at strategy without execution isn't going to get you anywhere. So, Kim, That is a marvelous overview of some of what you have done. You also teach, I know, and you've written a book, which is a practical book. I guess I say that because I think there's so many things that are ethereal and you can't apply them. A practical book you can really apply to real life and to work situations. So if you would just share with our audience to begin your background, why you got into doing, what your work experience is in the corporate world, because I know it's quite varied. And we'll go from there. Thank you. Welcome so much, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here. So, my background really is from a lot of the successes and the failures of trying to figure out how to be a leader. I've always wanted to lead, and so how to be a leader, but also I've been a deep student of business my whole life. I've always been very curious around how do businesses work? How do acquisitions work? What are the challenges? I've just really been curious about that. And I've always been most curious around how do you have a healthy business and how does leadership come into play? And early on in my career, I really didn't have strong leaders to as mentors, or as role models. Yeah. And that was really quite disappointing because I was looking forward to taking that type of path in my career. So what I started to do is just try to figure things out on my own, and when I was first leading others, I had a team and I was still, pretty young, and I was leading, I would say, probably more with my head than my heart. And I did not have the team doing what I needed them to do, and so I was failing as a leader. And so I went to my leaders and had said, can give me feedback. Something's not working. We're not getting the results we want. I don't know what to do. And they couldn't give me any feedback or any guidance.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And that was really a very pivotal point, because what I realized was that they were very young also in their careers. They hadn't been given the kind of leadership training that they would need to be able to really guide me. And so I then set out and looked at Marshall Goldsmith's book at the time, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. So that was like this big moment for me, and called up his firm and, requested to speak with one of his executive coaches, and ended up at the time talking with one of the principals in his firm who ended up taking me on as one of his coaches. And he had said, well, I usually just work with CEOs, but there's something about your story that's really interesting. And so it was through my proactive work that he came in, we did a 360 with the team, and we really turned it around, and we had people really advocating for me in the end, and the team performed. But that was really that pivotal piece of going through several years of trying to get people to just to have somebody to look up to, and not having anybody in my immediate, business community that was really highly effective. And so then trying to figure out myself. And so I don't ever feel like that I'll ever reach the end of learning to lead, but that was really that piece that set me down a path of trying to figure out how can I be a strong leader that then can empower people to do what they need to do to then fulfill the business, which ultimately, as you said, the tagline I use now is, solid strategy won't survive poor execution. And so the whole idea is, if you don't have that alignment between your people and the process, which is driven from the leadership lens, then you won't be able to execute well, your business won't be healthy. And so that's been just a constant theme. And as I've grown my leadership career, and I've grown other organizations, I've always kept those components in mind along the way. And by no means have I been perfect, but it's always that constant learning of trying to become better so I can be better for others and have them be their best selves.
So Kim, one of the things that you talk about is looking at how do you bridge those disconnects within the leadership group. What do you really mean by that? And how do you go about doing that? Because I think disconnects are huge and they happen so regularly.
They do. And so I agree with you. There's different levels of disconnects. Some are that you've got teams that work in silos. They work within their own pockets. They think that that what they do, they go heads down on and they do it. And what they fail to realize is that they're just a piece of the big picture, and that really their work is impacting so many different people, and that they need to be considering those other internal stakeholders, if you will. And so I think that's one of the big pieces of disconnect, because you can produce a product or you can implement a new system, and if you haven't actually done the work and having the right stakeholders involved to tell you, what does it look like to use this tool in the field, or what's the experience for our customers, then you've just really set yourself and the organization back. And so it's helping organizations realize that they're not on an island, or teams realizing they're not on an island. Also just looking at how people communicate. So a lot of times when senior leadership is in charge of working on the strategy, or they're in charge of just doing a lot of the bigger planning, and then they just suddenly it's rolled out. If there's really not the operational planning then that comes in, if it's just been strategy planning and the operational planning isn't put into place, then you start to have those disconnects of people trying to figure out, well, why are we doing this? Like, weren't we doing this other thing before? And so that's the other really big area that I see happening all too frequently, where organizations it's just breaking down. And so then people don't understand why what their purpose is, why they're there, why it matters, that sort of thing.
We spend so much time, Kim, talking about leadership and what's good leadership, but so few people really spend time talking about execution, a strategy. And so I see companies spending millions of dollars sometimes on things like culture, for example. But after years of work, they still don't implement the full culture, and they move on to a new fad before it's over. Right? So it's that execution piece is part of leadership that you've really tried to hone in on, as I understand it. And you have a process that you walk people through. What is that process?
So it's underpinning to any of the work that we do. And so it's assess, align, and accelerate. So what we do is we look at assessing that situation, where are the disconnects happening, who's got, their part in all those different pieces. And then we really look at the gaps. So what are we saying that we want? What are the actions showing? And what are the results that we're getting in that continuum? And then we start to say, okay, let's prioritize those disconnects and let's start to create a plan. And when we create the plan, then that's where we start to launch into that alignment period. As we play the plan out, we're starting to find the alignment around the people in the process, really. And the process oftentimes is the communication, and the people a lot of times is around either behavior, skill building, or just trying to understand why like, where do I fit in this whole thing? And then when we see that plan coming into play, really by the time we're hitting the end, the accelerate portion is really around the kind of the rinse and repeat. So now that we've got these right, you know what the right steps are for you, the next thing that you go to implement, follow the steps. Because the idea of our work is to give people, either the process, the skills, or both they don't have, but it's not to keep coming back and needing to stick around. It's really to help them become more self-sufficient, just understanding where perhaps they had blind spots and they need, that they just couldn't identify themselves.
So, Kim, you have a workbook around this. Is that something that you use in your training? And tell me a little bit about the workbook, because I'm listening to what you do and I think, wow, everybody could use this.
Yeah.
There's not a work group or a team that couldn't use what you're describing in terms of how do you really execute. So share a little bit about what you've done with your workbook and how people might be able to use it.
Yeah, great question. So what in the work I was doing the last several years ago now, I was really starting to track how individuals and teams were interacting with each other. And the reality is that we are just in a very busy business culture in our American society. That's not slowing down. And as much as we want to think we can slow that down, I think what we really have to think about is how can we be more mindful and intentional as we go through the day and move from a place of what feels like we're just checking the box and checking our list off to a place that says, okay, what's the impact I'm really making? And so what I was finding was that people were just rushing through their days and their weeks and then stopping to look back and not realizing, okay, how did we get here? Like, how did this thing not work the way we thought it would? How did I, find that I'm still in the same role after all these years when I really thought I was going to be moving myself along? And so what I created then, after having tested a lot of these different exercises, was a 12-week guided journal. And it's specific to looking at your successes, failures, and lessons learned. There's a few different exercises in it. That's the core one. And what it does is it encourages, either from an individual perspective or from a team perspective, to really say, okay, what are the 3 professional goals that I want to achieve, or we want to achieve in these next 12 weeks? And it gets really specific. And part of it does some forward, visioning. Okay, in 12 weeks from now, what's it going to look like if we accomplish this or if we don't accomplish this? And then you go through each week and you really are documenting what were the successes, the failures. And I chose that word intentionally because it's really a catalyst for growth. It's where we find the next place that we evolve from. And so I wanted that word to become something that people could maybe take a different approach to or a different mindset about. And then the lessons learned come from both. We want to learn what we did well so we can do more of that. And then we want to figure out what didn't land well so we can do something different. And at the end of each week, then you're realistically looking back and you're readjusting your goals. With what I said I wanted, now what actions did I take? What didn't serve me well? And then what do I need to do differently to go forward? And so there's a lot of accountability built into it that really then helps drive performance. But really what it ultimately does is help build confidence so that people can see the things that they're doing, so that the next time they want to have to put themselves up for a promotion, they can actually look back and say, hey, no, I'm very clear on what I've done, and not have to really struggle to think, well, am I qualified, or gosh, what was it that I've done, and just kind of hold themselves back and ultimately hold the company back.
So a person can use it also very proactively in terms of their own career growth.
Absolutely. Yeah, their own career growth, team alignment, performance, when the team's trying to say, okay, we've got this big thing ahead of us. What is it that we're committed to, and what do we want to make sure we're tracking, individually and collectively along the way as well?
You also talk a lot about communication and getting clear in communication, and you having a process that allows you to do that. And I'm guessing that's part of what's necessary if you're going to diminish the disconnects that exist. But share a little bit about that, because we talk a lot about communication, and yet it continues to, I think, always emerge in our conversations as the big need.
Yeah, it really does. I think it's the opportunity, I think, for everybody to always be mindful of, because again, we're moved through such a busy pace that we can make assumptions that people heard what we were talking about, or know what we're talking about. And so when you think about the why execution fails, communication is such a really key piece. And I talk about that from a process lens. So if you're going to roll something out, have you really thought about how that communication is going to roll out? Have you thought about filling in the gaps of why we're doing this thing, and what the pivotal piece was of that's caused us to make a shift, whether that's a shift towards an opportunity or a shift towards a different to help us avoid something that we don't want to hit. And so it's really critical that people think about that, that process, because ultimately people want to know why their work matters. They want to feel seen and heard, and they want to be able to be committed to the bigger goal. But if that's not clear to them, then you end up having you having disconnects. You have people that just don't buy into the idea, and disengaged and all that sort of thing. So it's really looking at these really core pieces, and not even necessarily having it to from a lens of something really big. I mean, it's just something from even day-to-day communication as we go into our team meetings weekly. What is that real message we're trying to deliver, and what is it that we're trying to make the connection on about what the team is able to do, and then where it fits inside the the organization.
So for you, as you look at working with companies, where are the biggest challenges? You're always looking to create a result, but what are the challenges you face?
So the challenges are, there's a couple of buckets. So one is sometimes especially earlier or less tenured leaders, new leaders, a lot of times there's some element of thinking that they're supposed to have been, gifted with leadership skills because they now have a leadership title. And so that's one of those pieces that sometimes there's this, hesitation to want to ask for guidance and help, because it's like, but I'm the CEO, or I'm the, head of this thing, and I'm supposed to know it. People expect me to know it. And that's really just a story we tell ourselves. People don't expect us to know everything when we first step in, right? There's the technical things that we should probably know or have an idea of, but we also should know how to ask for help. And we also should know how to say, you know what, I'm not clear on that in this role yet, but I'm going to figure it out and get back to you. And so I think it's having that ability to really be open and communicate. But I think that's one of the biggest things I run into, is that leaders just have a hard time of crossing that bridge. And I think that's why we then have a lot of just the persistence of poor leadership, because they're not thinking about that proactively. The other big disconnect really is in, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this thing? Why does this work matter? I come in and I can do my job well, but I really don't get how it fits inside the bigger picture. And so that's the other one where I believe, because oftentimes leaders are in different levels of meetings than frontline staff. We're talking and having these conversations and almost become immune to the topic or to how we're going to implement this information. And so we turn then to the frontline staff, who are really the ones who are going to be our talent to execute. And if we haven't actually bridged that gap or help them to see and to understand, then they're going to be lost, and I think that's the other place we find a big, huge disconnect in on a really consistent basis.
So Kim, if you could structure things ideally so you could really make an absolutely huge impact, how do you like to be brought into the whole process?
Ideally, it's always want to be brought into at the most senior level that we can, right? And it's really about, if it was ideal, it would be hey, we're starting this new team, or we're launching something new, or we're getting ready to really assess how our year's gone, and we know we want to make changes next year. So it's trying to be more proactive. I think what tends to happen is it's a much more reactive place of, oh my gosh, how did we get here? This isn't working. We need, it's coming from the place of, waking up suddenly and to realize that the results that are in front of them they don't like. And so that's more common. It's just a reality. But if that could shift, the more ideal place would be to have more proactive work. Look, we want to do things differently. Look, we want to lead. We want to look at our leadership style and our alignment as a team. We want to bring somebody in from the outside to actually give us some feedback and look at what we're doing well, what we're not doing well. And so really that would be more ideal. But work with what we have as it gets presented.
Well, you work with some, I think, difficult situations, because when I think of venture capital, a lot of times those are people who are doing a lot with a few people, and there may be frequent changes. These are assumptions I make. And so you have an environment that is somewhat in flux, and that's the environment you've chosen to work in. So share a little bit more about that.
I like it because there's so much energy and there's so much with just a little bit of work can make the whole thing run really smoothly. And what happens with a lot of the VC funded companies at the stages they're at is that, again, they're moving so fast. A lot of times the executive team tends to be made up of people who are really technically brilliant in whatever they did before. A lot of times it's, engineers or computer science, something really, really just marvelous in creating. What they don't, though, then have is the leadership side. And so what tends to happen is, a lot of times your founding team becomes the really savvy salespeople, but then they don't know how to actually build a sales team, or they can hire salespeople, but they don't know how to actually then translate how they sell as a founder to how you systematize and scale inside of an actual formal organization. And so those are where I think those are really exciting opportunities, because they're in some ways they're simple to fix, that once they put in place, like the whole system works. And so a lot of that is that disconnect in those early stage companies are between sales, marketing, and then, the product being built, and having all of those teams really work more synergistically. And then having those senior leaders recognize what it means to lead and to communicate when they're not maybe as naturally grounded in those areas.
So if you were going to, I think I really appreciate your, in a sense, it's attention to the detail, to the execution, because it is, in a sense, it's not sexy, it's not trendy, it's not that latest trend that you're going to read about, and yet what really makes things work is the nuts and bolts. And
Definitely.
we talk about not being siloed, but then we don't look at how do we bring those elements together so that they work together. And I think that's the gift that you give organizations, is you've really put some thought into how do you bring these together so they're connected and can execute out of connectedness.
Absolutely. And, you're right. It's always interesting when people sit down and say, well, we had all these initiatives we were going to accomplish last year, and we didn't really move the needle on many of them, or any of them. And what's exciting is it's always fun to vision and to strategize and to say, okay, what's the possibilities? And then the expectation is that everybody will just get on board at the same level of excitement and just run with it. And that's just not how we work as humans. We have to be brought along in the process and be kind of be sold into the ideas, and, or given compelling reasons why. And so that's where, as much as people want to put the time on the sexy side, they really then start to miss the big picture. And the big picture is that your execution will just be pretty much guaranteed to fail if you haven't put in place the thoughtfulness or the skills needed on the people side, and then you haven't really figured out how you're going to put the process side together. So you can't really avoid it, as much as it's not as fun. It's kind of the necessary evil to be able to then reap the rewards of all that fun strategy work that you did ahead of time.
Kim, it is, it's sad to have our time almost up, and because you have so much, and so much to offer. And I think from what I see in organizations, it is this execution, it's the disconnect, the lack of connectedness between different groups that creates so much unnecessary tension and an overwhelm, because people are trying so hard to make things happen. But if you don't have that process and system in place that you're speaking about, it is so difficult, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's just, and I think what scares people is they don't want to over process something. They don't want to have process to where it slows them down. And what I often remind them of is we're not talking about this really refined, integral level of process. We're talking about some really basic stuff like your consistency in your communication, how you deliver that message, before you go and just send an email out to people, has there been context built around this announcement you're going to give? And it's really going back to those fundamentals of that, some fundamentals of process that then can really make such a tremendous amount of difference. So I always like to say, it's let's talk about the right level of process that perhaps isn't in place today. That's really what we're focused on. And that's going to give, anybody the biggest, result if they can just get those basic pieces in place.
So, Kim, we're going to have to bring this to an end. And you have some marvelous material that you've made available to people, 2 different things that are available.
Yes.
If you would just explain a little bit about what those are so our audience can use them, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. So there's the 2 pieces are relevant to anybody. So whether you're leading people, business owner, or even an individual contributor, they're both relevant. So the first piece is a checklist of sorts around the 7 most common reasons strategic plans fail in execution. So not just strategic plans, but initiatives, your goals, that sort of thing. And so it runs through the 7, but it also gives a snippet of if you're experiencing this, consider this. And so it's a good checkpoint. The second piece is a short video. It's about 8 minutes long, and it gives some tips that anybody can put to use around how do you message to get people on board with whatever you're trying to roll out. Even if you're, as an individual contributor, you're trying to convince somebody around an idea you have. And so it really takes you through the steps around taking people through so they're current with you and they understand, okay, now I see why you're trying to move us in this direction. And so it's so both of those are very practical and something I want to make sure that we can offer to your listeners if they are wanting to take this work a little bit further.
So if you indicate, we'll have a place for you. You can put your comment in, send us an email. We will make these available or get you information so you can get this. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, Kim, is your workbook. It is titled what?
It's called Successes, Failures, and Lessons Learned, and it is that 12-week guided journal, and it is available on Amazon. So if you put the title in, Successes, Failures, and Lessons Learned, and put in Kim Bohr, Bohr, you'll be able to easily pull it up and take advantage of it right away.
Super. Thank you, Kim, so much for your time, for your wisdom. And, I appreciate your pragmaticness about what you are providing, because I think it's so much fun to talk about the lofty ideas of leadership and strategy. And the reality is it's in the execution that you win the battle. So thank you so much for what you've shared. And those of you who are listening, if you would like any of the information, you would like to be connected with Kim, we are glad to do that. Just let us know what you would like, and we will send you information. So thank you so much for listening to us today, and we look forward to talking with you very soon again. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
You've been listening to Building My Legacy podcast with Dr. Lois Sonstegard. To book your appointment with Dr. Sonstegard, visit www.buildtomorrow.com.